We're just beginning our journey in a world we know very little about. We have learned to understand what is good and what is bad based on the obvious. And we're afraid of everything that we don't know or don't understand, even if it's not bad. Hello, you're watching the open lesson of the Institute of Education Defenders of Peace. And today we will talk about what will help us understand everything that is happening. We will talk about the events in Ukraine. Now everyone is ready to discuss news reports from all sources, give voice to judgments, scream and cry. The space around is filled with emotions from so many people, so many minds. It is very important not to get lost in these opinions and find your own. To do this, you need to understand that everything is a little more complicated than it may seem, and the events of today originate long before our birth, the birth of our moms and dads, grandparents. Have a look at the screen. We spoke the same language. We have the same history and customs. We called ourselves the Russian people and were united. Slavic tribes were called the people of Russia until the middle of the last century. Ukrainians were the people living in the borderlands. The term was applied to different regions of Russia, for example, Pskov, Siberian Ukraine. We are similar as different versions of each other. We have almost the same fall costumes and dwellings, household utensils and food. We celebrate the same holidays and read the same fairy tales to children. We cultivated the same land and ate the same bread. Our ancestors fell in love and formed families. We have always been part of the same family for the longest of histories. The people who inhabited Kiev and Rus were periodically attacked by nomadic tribes. We were expelled from our lands, but we returned. With the collapse of Kiev and Rus, we were separated by different borders. All this has had a huge impact on culture and languages. But even after that, we didn't cease to understand each other, creating new milestones in our shared history as one ethnicity. But one day, we worry that people can say we don't even know each other. Denis Polunchikov, a TV presenter and journalist, a member of the central headquarters of the All Russia People's Front, will help us to understand this topic. Good afternoon, Denis. Hello, Sofia. How did it happen that people that were once so close can now have these relations? The Ukrainian crisis didn't start yesterday, and in general, it's not about Ukraine. What do you mean? Russia is a strong power with a huge amount of strategic resources. And which people typically want to benefit from that strength? Is it beneficial to those who are weaker? That's right. The strong can always help the weak. And if there is a power that is at least close to comparable to Russia's strength, then what would they likely want? Well, if they can be the only possible opponent, and then depending on the goal, can be a likely threat. Well, where is Ukraine here? I don't know. I don't understand it all yet. How can you win a battle against a nuclear power? In direct combat? No. Unless you turn the power of this country against themselves. Have you ever heard the ancient principle of divide and rule? This is the best method of controlling any state. All you have to do is, first, to split up society and peoples, second, to create conflict between different parts of society, which then leads to the collapse of the country. And the split is the collapse of the Soviet Union? Well done. It all came together. This is just the tip of the iceberg, but now everything is much clearer. I'm not sure. Didn't it break up by itself? This issue is very complicated. A number of both external and internal factors contributed to this. Wait, so all these events, demonstrations in Kazakhstan, Belarus, they're all coming from the same concept of divide and rule? Yes. These are all parts of the same story. The collapse of the Soviet Union was the beginning of a series of events that changed the worldview of many people. These events happened about 30 years ago. 30 years is enough for a whole generation to pass. Now, what was new to the previous generation is natural for the current one. The author of textbooks and expert in military history, Petr Alexandrovich Ishkov, will tell us more about this. What happened to the republics after the collapse of the Soviet Union? First of all, after their independence, the textbooks in schools were rewritten. The new authors of these textbooks would write that we are more like different nationalities than one shared culture. What can be so bad about writing that? A common history is full of events that you have to fully understand to understand ourselves, but when textbooks say that a nationwide tragedy like the Holodomor was a purposeful act of aggression against ethnic Ukrainians, then you can start to convince multiple generations of people who will begin to question and completely deny the shared history. It turns out that they sincerely believe in what they're doing. Yes. And what else was written that was untrue? There were some wartime criminals that were recognized as national heroes. And who is that? Stepan Bandera is a Ukrainian nationalist who was radically violent in his views and approaches. Also, Ivan Mazepa became a folk hero, someone who had betrayed Peter I and joined his opponents to fulfill his greedy interests. It should be noted that he wasn't supported by Ukrainians. I don't understand how someone can write about someone evil as if they're good. This is how the differences between good and evil are washed away. People stop understanding each other. This is how they start to drift apart, because they aren't given an opportunity to understand the same stories and background. But you can't stop everyone from communicating and talking. Exactly. Our common culture and shared background is how we understand each other. The shared mentality and the ability to find common ground are how we preserve our shared culture. Are Russian-speaking Ukrainians forbidden to speak Russian? Speaking Russian is prohibited in the service sector, in cafes, shops, hairdressers, hotels. That was put into law under the last president of Ukraine and now has entered into force. And even the incomplete general secondary education law was signed, right? Back in March of last year, a law was signed that eliminated Russian-speaking schools in the country. All Russian language education has been cancelled. But long before that, the idea of speaking Russian was being degraded and made out to be bad. Russian language were criticized, calling it Russification, and common words were called Russianisms. Although the appearance of such words as finer didn't bother anyone. What is finer? This is from the English word fine. It's hard for me to believe that all this is happening. And now we come to the events taking place today. Oh no, firstly, a little more on the history. First, it's worth saying about the demonstrations in Ukraine. The first big demonstration was not as strong as the later ones. It was called the Orange Revolution. It is often called a rehearsal rally. The massive, months-long protests began in November 2013. It was called Maidan, or Euromaidan. It started because of the Ukrainian government's suspension of the negotiations of signing an association agreement between Ukraine and the European Union. A huge number of those wanting to join the European Union got to the central square of Kiev. The military had orders to not to use force. But even then, brothers turned against brother. The military were bombarded with firebombs, beaten with chains, attacked in cars. Young guys died, and they couldn't defend themselves. Many died then, but no one remembered the names. Young guys were fatally wounded and were unable to defend themselves. Even then, their death felt like it did not count, and that their lives seemed as though it wasn't important. So we don't even know whether or not they were against the ideas of the time. Yes, blatant injustice occurred in Odessa. Here opponents of European integration were blocked in the house of trade unions. Then firebombs were thrown and dozens of people were trapped inside. Some, trying to escape from the fire, had to jump out of the windows. More than 100 people died that evening. And when the referendum took place and the residents of Donetsk, Lugansk, Crimea chose the side of Russia, they simply began to be attacked consistently. Crimea and Sevastopol were reunited with Russia since these lands historically belonged belong to us. And in Lugansk and Donetsk, the war has been going on for over 8 years, and none of the Western world has recognized this ongoing terror to our people. And while the Western world didn't recognize the rights of the people in those regions to choose their beliefs and sides, instead foreigners are able to provoke new fights, send shipments of weapons, and finance more infighting, debate, conflicts, and fear. Now let's watch the video talking about this topic. It started in June 2014. We decided to separate from Ukraine. They started shelling us in the morning and in the evening. My husband and I went to the referendum and we were fired by our own. We went to the referendum under the fire. In 2014, they scattered leaflets. They wanted us quickly run away from our homeland to liberate this territory. They don't need people who live in our land. They need our land, our coal, and they don't need people at all. They need our land. They don't need us. They need our land. They don't need people. My Natasha died. They were walking down the Shakhter Street to kindergarten and died. The child was 4 and she was 25. Children, there is no their fault in anything. They've done nothing wrong to live in such a terrible world. I heard some bomb blast and noise outside the window, as if something had fallen or exploded. It was probably the strongest explosion in my life. I was scared. I ran up to my mother. My brother was next to her. We tried to call Dad, but there was no connection. Ukraine had been firing at us. They hate us. It seems that even when I was 7, I understood that it was a war. I was worried about my parents, for my little brother. I saw him crying, and I was crying next to him. Don't they have children like ours? Are we not moms like them? And when they started bombing us, killing children and women, all people, then I realized that they hate us. Even though we didn't do anything wrong. We didn't go to war with them. They started it. It's 2022. He asks, "Mom, what's happening?" "Son, we're under the fire. We need to leave." He asks, "And what about Dad?" And Dad couldn't leave. He defends his homeland. It's terrible when you realize that a person will not come back. It hurt so much. We couldn't explain it to children. I heard they started shooting. I was terrifying. But I was able to take it. I heard something flying through the window, glass breaking in the kitchen. When I came out, I saw that there was a grenade splinter on my desk and glass all over the apartment. They started shooting. They promised that there would be a chemical attack. We were frightened. The shelling started, the children were scared, and they were crying. And when the explosion started, it was impossible to stay at home. In 8 years, I almost got used to it. It turns out that you are used to war. Yes. I think they don't remember peace, because the explosions don't stop. They say we attacked them. They say we're shooting ourselves. When it started, they said that they didn't use weapons against civilians, but we were bombed with prohibited weapons. As soon as they start bombing, they have a psychological panic. We're not able to forget it. Unfortunately, there is the information war. Everyone says, help Ukraine, we have children and families. We also had children and families 8 years ago. And now the media is saying things that are not really there. And who saw that we have been suffering for 8 years? Has anyone seen it? No one saw it, and no one heard us. Of course, they won't hear us. They only hear what they want. We hope everything will end and we will go back home. We hope to live as before. We hope it will be quiet. We don't want a war. We want to live in peace and harmony. We want to see our relatives. We want a peaceful sky over our heads and a peaceful future for our children from both sides. We need to be heard and understood.
Родители остались дома, защищать свой дом, свою землю, чтобы все-таки дети жили на своей родине под мирным небом.
So, how are the kids now? Where are they? This year, in February, the situation in Donbass escalated. You should have heard that the shelling by Ukrainian security forces resumed. The republics announced a general mobilization and began to ask for help and support from Russia. The first thing they did is evacuating civilians to the Russian territory. They saved now. This decision was not easy for us. Why? Russia has been calling on other countries for many years to recognize the sovereignty and independence of the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics. However, this did not happen for 8 years. Instead, the civilian population of these territories has been subjected to terror and fighting. A number of protocols were signed addressing this ongoing conflict in the southeastern region of Ukraine. As a result, the violent war was suspended repeatedly, but was never stopped. And those protocols were constantly violated. And what was written in those protocols? The main point of the protocols was to require them to stop shelling the republics. According to the latest UN data, about 14,000 people were reported to be victims of the conflict. And what happened next? While various information outlets shifted to blame to Russia and the unrecognized republics, in the Donetsk and Lugansk regions, children continued to sit in bomb shelters. I'd like to note that we have never stopped attempts to rescue these people without the use of special forces. We couldn't just ignore them. We had to try to protect them. The recognition of the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics by force became the only possible solution under these conditions. On February 21st, Russia's president and the country recognized the independence of the republics and stood up for all those who weren't protected from the rest of the world.
Признать независимость и суверенитет Донецкой Народной Республики и Луганской Народной Республики.
Lugansk and Donetsk are not land, they are people. We're stopping the 8-year war of the Ukrainian ruling regime, backed by NATO and against our own citizens and Ukrainians. It was not started by us. Right now, Russia is taking action to end it. Ukraine was going to join NATO and was strongly supported by the West. Back in 1991, the US leadership promised Moscow not to expand NATO to the east. However, since that time, there have been 5 waves of NATO expansion. If such a scenario happens with Ukraine, it could mean that the school children who are watching us perhaps in 2-3 years would have to go to war and repel attacks on our country. And how should we perceive all these threats that we hear every time there is something happening? For example, about sanctions. Those threats. Today, our economy is much more stable than in 2014. This is recognized by various international financial institutions. I feel bad now. I'm talking about sanctions, but people's lives and the world is actually at stake. In general, I know it's easier to overcome difficulties together. We will cope. But the main thing is no one else dies. I have a question. What is this special operation? What does it
Это когда
mean?
цели ведут к миру. Мы не
This is when
атакуем
our
жилых
goals lead
домов,
to peace.
мы не бьем по мирным гражданам, мы не
By disarming, we take away the risk of having our borders and independent republics attacked.
водоканалы, подстанции. Мы принуждаем к
We
миру
will only
Украину,
attack
не
military
допускаем
facilities.
развития ее
We do not
военным
strike
потенциалом,
residential buildings,
уничтожаем глобальную
civilians, and
угрозу,
social
которая может
facilities
возникнуть
like
для
schools,
нашей страны, для
kindergartens,
наших
gas stations, and
новых
water
союзников в
utilities.
виде Луганской и Донецкой республик.
Now you understand that this special operation is actually helping to end events that started many years ago.
Значит, и не нами войны.
Да, но мне
It's hard for me
сложно это
to
понять.
understand this now, but
теперь
at
я
least
хотя
I'm
бы
starting to see the
начинаю
logic.
видеть логику,
Although I
хотя
don't see the logic
и
in many
не
other
вижу
things
логики в
now
одном и в
too.
другом.
In what?
Я не понимаю,
I don't
почему,
understand
когда
why the
весь
whole
мир
world says
строит
it wants to build
взаимоотношения на
relationships
мире
on
и
pace
свободе
and
слова,
freedom of
то
speech,
почему это
but
применимо
only when
только
it
в
relates to
определенных
their own
вопросах?
sides.
Почему есть люди,
Why are there
которые имеют
people who
значение,
matter
и
and
люди,
people
чью
that they
беду
don't
никто не
care
хочет
about?
видеть? Почему
Why
людей
did
в Донецкой
Europe
и
turn a
Луганской
blind
областях
eye on the attacks
Европа не
in the Donetsk
воспринимала,
and
и
Lugansk
никто не говорил
regions?
о жестокости и о
Remind me
дихуманности?
again how many people
Сколько людей
died there during
погибло
the
там
military
во время
conflict.
военного конфликта?
According to some sources, about 14,000 civilians.
Вот.
See, why doesn't the
Почему
world talk
мир не
about
говорил
that?
об этом? Почему
Why only
14
notice
тысяч
those
жизней будут
14,000
замечены
lives
только в том
when it's
случае,
beneficial to
когда
someone?
это кому-то
It seems like
выгодно?
not all
Получается,
human lives
что
matter, only
имеет
certain
значение
ones,
не
and not in all
человеческая
areas
жизнь
of the
или
world.
мир?
Yes, Sophia, you're right that sometimes a human tragedy becomes a reason for speculating on feelings, emotions, and the world.
Мир очень
The world is very
странный. Это,
strange.
как я раньше не могла
It's like
понять,
just when I
почему
couldn't
все
understand why
кричат,
everyone is
что в
shouting
Африке
that there
нет
is no
воды,
water
и
in
возят туда
Africa,
бутылки
and
с
yet
водой,
I've seen
оказывая
carrying
гуманитарную
bottles of
помощь,
water
вместо
there,
того, чтобы
providing
просто
humanitarian aid
провести
instead of
водопровод.
just providing running water. Oh well, you've gone too far. Although the main message is that the world doesn't always act according to the laws it talks and says it holds true. Let's watch a little video about this topic.
Всего доброго, Денис.
Спасибо,
Всего
до
доброго,
свидания.
София. До свидания.
The media has long been focused not on the truth, but on the illusion of truth. All those Instagram masks and glossy faces. Look, I'm helping animals here, and now I'm brought groceries to my grandmother. Without the phone camera turned on, no one will throw a cone into a street musician's head. Look, I'm a virtue. These strange adults say and post a new snippet of their lives for the public's approval. But as soon as the camera turns off and the real life begins, then all morality, humanity, altruism and friendliness become less significant. It seems that the demonstration of good deeds, right thoughts and humanity is just an act of self-positioning, which is usually demonstrated with a necessary frequency. Good seems like a bargaining chip, but does it exist without witnesses? Why do world leaders talk about human rights on our screens, but then use those suffering as a tool for their own crimes? For example, about 80% of all armed conflicts that occurred between the end of World War II and 2001 were unleashed by the US authorities. North Korea, Vietnam, Kosovo, Afghanistan, Iraq and Syria. We know from childhood that if you promise to do something, then you should follow through on the promise. But why don't adults keep their own promises and guarantees? Guarantees of peace, respect of borders, the promises of security and mutual support. In every news report and speech of these rulers, they don't get tired of shouting about the value of human life. Then why is the death penalty still legal in some countries? Where does their humanity and high moral values disappear at this moment? In 2019, 6,057 executions were carried out in 20 countries. This time, the scene for the performance is selected, the audience is the whole world, and this whole Western world, full of humanity and peacefulness, is peacefully sending weapons and equipment to the epicenter of these events, just when the eyes of the whole world are watching and for the sake of virtue signaling. If it is so important to show yourself to the whole world as a friend, it turns out that the allies only stir up conflict and are in no hurry to help, but they feed their media with intrigue and stories. The good exists, and there is a lot of it. There is nothing wrong with showing your good deeds online, but only if you can honestly say, am I doing this in order to earn another like, or I'm really doing a good thing.
Всё это время в
During
моей
this
голове
entire
крутятся,
discussion,
слова
Caesar's
Цезаря:
words about
«Разделяй
divides and
и
rule
властвуй».
keeps running in my head. Yes, this is exactly what the West uses. If people cannot be defeated, then they must be split up. After one by one loses support and are pitted against each other, it is much easier to defeat them. So, they split us up by any
А
means.
как, мы
And
сейчас
how
можем
can we now
помочь
help
тем,
those who
кто
came from the
приехал
Donetsk
из
and Lugansk
Донецкой и
republics?
Луганской республики?
Humanitarian aid reception points have started operating in many cities. Their locations are listed for everyone. You can help people with food, basic necessities, clothing. You can also join a volunteer organization and help coordinate people on the ground.
Мне кажется,
It seems to me that it is important now to support each other, stay in touch with family and friends, and behave like people from one history. Even on social media, for example, where there are loads of different opinions or unreliable information, you need to think critically and analyze the news that you see. You're absolutely right about social media. Many people have been spreading alleged footage of the war in Ukraine, but in fact, it is of other military conflicts. Someone even took footage from computer games, overlaid some sound and passed it off as the truth, or photos from 2014, 2015 published as if it is today's events. How do you know if you're watching a real video or a fake one? You can search for the same pictures or videos in search engines and pay attention to the date of publication of the news. If that doesn't work, then look closely at the image. Pay attention to the weather and clothes. Girls can't be dressed in light dresses now, as in this photo, for example, and behind them are green trees. Really? In February? By the way, these are from videos shot in 2017, but which are actively being passed off as today's events. This is understandable. It helps to set aside our emotions and take a closer look at the background around. And what about the footage of military equipment or shelling? I don't understand anything about it. In this case, it is best to rely on official media statements and wait for confirmation of information. I'm sure you have seen these shots of a house destroyed by rockets in Kiev. Information quickly spread on social media that it was a missile of Russian troops. But this is not the case. First, we know that the Russian Minister of Defense instructed our military to only target military facilities and to not touch civilians. The Ukrainian military, after signing a promise to not fight anymore, let them go home. Secondly, the missile is dark in color, its contrail is white. This is a typical missiles for the armed forces of Ukraine. Also, if the rocket was Russian, then its fragments would have already been shown on all television channels, but that didn't happen. What else in the latest news is untrue? During the operation on Snake Island in the Black Sea, the Ukrainian border post was captured. According to foreign media, 13 people were killed during the operation. The president of Ukraine said that these people will receive the title of Hero of Ukraine posthumously. However, the Russian Defense Ministry said that actually the military garrison voluntarily surrendered. There were 82 of them. At the same time, those who surrendered were safely taken to Sevastopol and was provided with food and medical care. And also, at the request of the military, they will be delivered back to their homeland. Here is another example. Information appeared on the web about how the Russian military shoots civilians on the move. It turned out that in this news, the authors used the filming of a program dedicated to the events of the spring of 1942. This is a real information war. That's right. There are lots of such fake videos, and by the day, and it seems there are more and more of them. Rockets that hit a kindergarten, columns of destroyed tanks, down planes. So, before posting any information on social media, make sure to check the authenticity of its sources. And everything that you see now, analyze and critically check. Only after doing those, you can stop believing those you subscribe to on social media. Now I understand that I didn't pay enough attention to such news. But now I
сейчас
will
обязательно
definitely
буду
double
всё
check
проверять.
everything. That's right. We have tried to help you understand the situation that we are all watching today. Take care of the history of our country. Stay attentive to each other. Do not let yourself be deceived. Follow the laws and remember the importance of the words and promises. Don't forget that you are the future generation of our great country and should be proud to stand up with us. This
На
is
этом
the end
наш
of our
урок
lesson.
подошел к концу.
See you
До
soon.
новых встреч!
Goodbye.